Okay, so I've demonstrated pretty much every other portion of knitting except for one, and that is, of course, how are you going to get this thing off the needles? You need to turn all of those what we call live stitches, meaning if you did take them off of your needle, there's a serious threat of your project unraveling, and after putting in all that hard work, of course, we don't want that. So we have a little technique called binding off, and I have two particular ways that I like to bind off my patterns. There are quite a few more, but these are the two that are probably the easiest, and so I'm going to show you them. Let's get your project finished, shall we? Now I'm going to demonstrate how to bind off. There are two fairly easy ways that you can bind off, and I'm going to demonstrate both of those, one on each half of this round. So we'll start off with the very, very common knitted bind off method, and it really could not be easier. With the knitted bind off method, you're going to, sorry about that, you're going to start off by knitting 2 stitches. You're going to take the first stitch and pull it up and over the second stitch, and you'll just pull it off like that. Okay, so you see there you've bound off 1 stitch. You had 2 stitches on this needle, and now you just have 1. And you will just keep doing that over and over and over until you have just 1 stitch left. And when you have just 1 stitch left, what you're going to do is you're going to cut the yarn, you're going to break the yarn, and you'll just pull that up and out and pull it tightly, and it'll be nice and secure. Obviously we're not there yet, but that's how you do that. You can also do the knitted bind off with purl stitches. You see I've knit 1 stitch and I've purled this stitch, and then I just pull that up and over. Whenever you happen to see a pattern that tells you to bind off in pattern, that's exactly what they're referring to. They're saying that when you're binding off, you're going to purl the purl stitches just like this, and you'll knit the knit stitches just like this while you're binding off. And that's actually very important to the look of a lot of knitting projects, that you actually do bind off in pattern. So most of the time, even if it doesn't tell you to bind off in pattern, I would highly suggest you do it anyway, just because most of the time it's going to look a little nicer. It'll look more finished. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and finish binding off this half of the row, and then I'll come back and show you my other favorite binding off method. So now let me demonstrate my other favorite bind off method, and it is called Jenny's Surprisingly Stretchy Bind Off. And it's quite a fascinating bind off method. It's very similar to the knitted bind off, but it just has one extra step, and I will show you what that is. This is obviously the stitch left over from the other half of the round. Now what I'm going to do before I knit this stitch, and I will knit this stitch in a minute, I'm going to do a yarn over. Now the yarn over that I do is going to depend on whether this is a knit stitch or a purl stitch. For the knit stitch, I'm going to wrap the yarn around my needle from back to front. And the way you can tell the difference is that the yarn will wind up going towards the back, just like you need for a knit stitch. So then I will knit that stitch, and then I'm going to take both this yarn over wrap and the original stitch here. I'm going to pick them up, and I'm going to pass them over that stitch. and that has bound off one stitch, obviously, because we added the yarn over wrap. Now for a purl stitch, we're going to do the opposite. We're going to start in the front and slip it over to the back, and then we're going to bring the yarn to the front, and then we will purl that stitch, and again we will take the yarn over wrap and that original stitch, and we will pass it over that stitch. Now, how do you keep in mind, or how do you remember which direction you're supposed to be wrapping the yarn? Honestly, it's pretty easy because your yarn will tell you when you're trying to do the stitch. So here we've got a purl stitch. So what would happen if I tried to go back to front? See, that seems reasonable, right? Because your yarn is winding up in the front. But look what happens when you try to purl the stitch. See, this isn't secure at all. And look at that. You try to purl and that yarn wrap just comes right off. Whereas if you go from front to back, you can bring that yarn to the front, and that's nice and secure. And you can purl that stitch, and that yarn wrap will remain in place. And then you can pull it up and pass it over the leftmost stitch on your needle. Conversely, let's say we're going to knit this stitch. Conversely, let's say we do the opposite. We go from back to front. Again, you think, oh well, you know, my yarn winds up in the back, so that should work for the knit stitch. Again, you can see while you're trying to knit that stitch, that yarn wrap, it kind of stays on and almost works, but it just works so much easier. Hopefully I don't lose my stitch here. It just works so much easier if you go from back to front and then hold the yarn in the back. It's just nice and secure and stable. Then you can knit that stitch easily without worrying about that yarn over falling off. And then you can take those two stitches and pass it over the leftmost stitch. So there you have it. There are the two methods of binding off, the knitted bind off and Jenny's surprisingly stretchy bind off. And now you can finish your project. Okay, now we've bound off all the stitches, including this one. And what we'll do now is we'll cut that yarn, we'll pull that stitch up and out and pull it nice and tight. But see here you can see there are no live stitches left aside from that one, but it's not really live because once we cut it we can just pull it right out. And your project is now nice and secure. It's not going to fall out, it's not going to unravel. It's ready for washing, blocking, wearing, enjoying.